Recently, I leveled a boss killer, so I put it to work speed mapping. Well, sort of. I put it to work speed boss killing, and I did that through Guardian invitations. In this video, I'm running both Shaper and Elder Guardians, but depending on the economy, it might be more efficient to run Elder Slayers, Synthesized Guardians, just Shaper, or just Elder. I started this with a very initial low investment of around 20 Divines, and used a strategy that self-sustained. And I used that to farm, well, let's just say a lot, but more details about that later because it is a little bit complicated. And so this is how I took 20 Divines and turned it into a Mageblood in about a day. My setup was pretty simple. I used a few Bestiary Scarabs that I had lying around, and then a bunch of Einhar missions. I also used polished Harbinger Scarabs as I was trying to get Fracturing Shard drops. Because I have 7th Gate, I used 2 Chaos to put Essence on with the map device. Then I ran 4 Sextants. Copy Beast, Harbinger Currency, Gilded Scarab, and Shaper or Elder map. I bought about 10 Shaper and 10 Elder. The Elder maps are a little bit slower, taking about a minute longer, but they're definitely cheaper for the Sextant. Shaper costs a little more, but it's about a minute faster. On average, I spent 3.5 minutes completing a Shaper map and 4.5 minutes completing an Elder map. I did try to use the Viridian Wildwood, and my build had more than enough damage and defenses to handle it, but unfortunately, it took a lot of time, almost doubling the time it took me to complete a map, or 50% on the generous end, which just didn't feel worth it as it's not going to scale a lot of the drops, such as boss rewards. I also had to buy 4 formed invitations for 6 divines and around 2.5 div in remnants to use on my essences. And if you want to know more about the build I used, do be sure to get subscribed. I'm almost done with the gear, at which point I'll be making a video. And maybe leave a like while you're down there. But for now, let's get into more details of a farming strategy, starting with the Atlas that I used. So here's my Atlas strategy for Harbinger, Essence, Beast, Boss Rush. The reason that I included the mechanics that I did is in part because I thought they were very synergistic, and in part because I just like them. The most important feature is destructive play, causing the Maven to summon 1 to 3 additional bosses when witnessing map bosses. This, combined with Vivid Memories, Remnants of the Past, and Conquered Conquerors, mean that you get a lot more Shaper, Elder, Synthesized, and Conqueror map drops, including things like the Cortex. Another big highlight is 7th Gate, which requires that you allocate all 3 of the gateways on your Atlas. This is so that I can put Essence on every map with the map device, because Essence is very fast, very point efficient, and highly profitable. You want +1 Essence, chance to duplicate, 1 tier higher, and of course additional Essence chance. From there you have what I call add-in mechanics, things that you can add but aren't a core part of a strategy. For example, Seance, which I added in just so that I could use the Gilded Scarab Sextant. If you're not using that Sextant, maybe because the price is shifted or you're watching this in a future league where Scarabs aren't as valuable, then you don't need Seance and you can use the points elsewhere. I put Delirium on for the same reason. It's something that happens passively as I'm clearing the map, and Delirium orbs are quite high value. You could invest further into it, such as giving bosses a higher chance to spawn, or maybe even getting some extra Delirium orb drops. This would be in lieu of something like Seance, Bestiary, or Harbinger. For Bestiary, I added it because red beasts kind of just evaporate, and there's always a chance to get a frog. Note, in the last 80 maps that I did, which I recorded for this dataset, I didn't actually get a frog, but more interesting things about that when I tally up the results and tell you what is and isn't worth it. Luckily, it's not that hard to drop. You could just drop these points and these points here, and then you're good to go. I mean, you kind of have to come down here for the gate anyway, so it's not like you're losing that much. Last up, Harbinger, because I wanted to drop Fracturing Shards. Personally, I wouldn't do this one unless you're also going to be adding them either with a map device, which I wouldn't advise, or via a Scarab. So if you dropped that and went in on everything else, you could use Stream of Consciousness and use no fragments at all, especially if you had a lot of Einhar missions saved up like I did. Last up, a lot of your value comes from dropped maps, so you want as many map drop duplication nodes as you can get. Each 0.5% chance really does add up as you take more and more of them. Before you know it, you'll be dropping things like a double Cortex or more likely a double Guardian map. And so that's how I set up my Atlas for this strategy. I made a few creative liberties just to cater to the mechanics that I like, but overall, the core concept should be the same for everyone, at least with destructive play and the focus on essences. Beyond that, you can do pretty much anything that works well in low-tier maps. You could do a version that has Ultimatum instead of Delirium, for example, or Heist instead of Beasts. So my strategy is pretty simple. Open up the map, make sure my sextants are applied, use Essence on the map device, and put on an Einhar mission, or make sure my scarabs are in place. From there, run through the map, kind of blasting anything that I come across, but not focusing on any one thing for too long. The goal is to get through the map quickly and get to the boss, ideally before the Delirium fog runs out, if it's present. From there, I kill the boss, which yes, it's Maven witnessed, and yes, it's much scarier due to the Sextant. It'll have more health and damage, and be a terrifying force. However, I'm playing a build that has so much damage that this really didn't matter, and most of the time the boss evaporated in mere seconds, especially if it didn't have terrible map mods. There's no point in rolling your maps to make them super dangerous. There's also no point in going into the Viridian Wildwood. All these things do is slow you down without proportionally increasing the loot, because so much of the loot is an unmodifiable reward. Therefore, you want to go for speed and efficiency and only deal with map mods that you can actually handle. If your build's towards the weaker end, I would genuinely recommend scouring all your maps, as this is going to make things much simpler. After doing this 4 times, the Maven will have collected all the bosses. If I dropped a Guardian invitation during that time, perfect, I can run it. If not, I'd go to trade and buy it. I ended up sustaining all of the Elder Guardian invitations, but I didn't sustain the Shaper ones. I don't know if this is just RNG variance, or if you slightly under-sustain. However, of the 20 invitations that I ran, I bought 5 of them. So overall it's not perfect, but it definitely could be worse, as I was coming pretty close to sustaining, and this is well within variance for 20 sets. The reason that I did a little bit of Shaper and a little bit of Elder was simply because I wanted to try out both and see if there are any patterns. And yes, Shaper's much faster, which is probably why it's a little bit more expensive, due to being more desirable. If you're willing to go a little bit slower with Elder though, it is still quite rewarding, and then you could always run the Elders if you wanted for even more loot. Or maybe just a bunch of disappointment because in small sample sizes, bosses are RNG. Now, when running your maps, rolling them isn't important, but when running your invitations, rolling them is incredibly important. It's the difference between getting 2 or 3 Maven splinters and getting 6 or 7. So I always tried to roll them to at least 70 or 80% quant, and then corrupted it, hoping it would go multi-mod for 100+. This is by far the most rewarding experience, and led to me getting 6 or 7 on most of my completions. However, it does make them a lot more dangerous, so you'll need a strong build able to take on super juiced Shaper or Elder Guardians. But of course, after running everything, you also need to check out the loot. So let's do that. So here I have almost everything that I dropped. Quite a few maps, some beasts, these are only the ones that I actually intend to sell, lots of essences, some mixed random things that I happen to pick up along the way, of course, all the gilded scarabs from my sextant, the Guardian fragments and maps, since this is to over-sustain the strategy, and the Maven's Writs, which are a bulk of the profits. In fact, if we're talking about single items, Maven's Writs are the single most impactful one. There was also a Divine Orb in here, but it sadly got eaten when I was doing metacrafting on my helmet earlier, so rip that Divine Orb, but trust me, it definitely was here a little bit ago. I think the other stack was some Chaos Orbs that also got eaten. One very unfortunate downside of using dump tabs to track your loot is when you're using the game's various crafting features, it likes to eat your currency. Now luckily in this case I did notice that the Divine got eaten, but I'm sure there's plenty of times when doing this that some Chaos gets eaten here or there, which is why I always say, this is a really rough example. It's not necessarily indicative of your experience, especially since I only ran 80 maps, and realistically, to get a good sample size, I'd probably have to run 800 or 8,000, which is something that personally I very much don't have the patience for. Given that it took me 3.5 to 4.5 minutes per map, and I ran 80 maps, we're looking at 5 to 6 hours of mapping time. More if you're the sort of person who likes to dawdle around in their hideout, but I don't know how fast your build is. It could be that what's 3.5 minutes for me is 2.5 for you, or what's 4.5 for me is actually 7 for you. You'll just have to try this for yourself and see where your time lands. One of the things I liked about using the Shaper or Elder map sextant is I sustained all the maps that I needed to use, and I sustained most of the invitations as well, which really helped to keep my costs down. In terms of total costs, the initial input was around 20 divines. A lot of this was on the Sextants, and I didn't need to spend all of it. I could have just done all the Elder maps, which would be a lower input cost and a higher profit. Or I could have bought the maps individually and sold the fragments as I went. The fragments and the maps are almost the same price, so you can pretty much go even if you're willing to put up with some tedious trading. But personally, I'd much rather get 40 or 50 fragments and sell them all at once for a higher price in bulk, and just not have to deal with that, even if it means that I spend 8 divines up front instead of 5 or 6. Now, of my initial investment, around 3 divines went into the Harbingers, and I got back 14 shards of a fracturing orb, which is a lot. In fact, it's worth about 20 divines, so that was well worth it from a cost-benefit perspective, though it did add a lot of time, which might have made it less worth it if you want to go super fast. Beasts were an interesting one, because I didn't actually get very lucky. I got no Krakic Chimeras, that's the big hit, and at 14C each, I spent around 1 divine to set everything up. But I got back over 5 divines and beasts, most of which could be sold quite quickly for bulk. Which means even though I didn't get any of the good hits, which I would say is a little bit unlucky, I still turned a handy profit, and again, they don't take very much time because my build annihilates them instantly. If your build struggles with red beasts, I very much would not consider doing that. Then in terms of the Shaper and Elder Guardian maps, or Conqueror stuff in general, because it's a little hard to separate it out afterwards, I ended up with 15 spare Elder Guardian maps worth 20 Chaos each, 22 Shaper Guardian maps worth 25C each, 19 Elder Slayer maps worth 60C each, 2 Cortexes worth 4 divines total, and 7 synthesized maps worth 50C each, which is around 13 divines total in maps back. A very significant part of a profit, but not everything. I also got an Awakened Weapon Elemental Damage, which was worth around 5.5 divines, and a puzzle box that's worth just under 3, or does actually sell for 3 in bulk. Now, when I tallied everything else up, the essences, the random junk, the stacked decks, the Maven invitations, the Maven's Ritz herself, the fragments, all that stuff, I ended up with 121 divines in value according to TFT's bulk selling tool. Now, realistically, what I'm going to do is use Harvest. Do things like convert one type of essences into another, or one type of Delirium orb into another, to sell only the most valuable. This will take a little bit of extra time, probably a half hour to an hour, and a little bit of extra currency, a couple more divines. But allow me to get significantly higher results when I do sell everything, because not only will I have a lot of one thing that typically sells for more currency, but I'll have the things people most desire, which means everything will sell almost instantly. And so this begs the question, should you be able to farm a Mageblood by doing Guardian Invitation farming? And will you get it in only 80 maps? Personally, I would say if your build is strong enough to absolutely annihilate them, yes, you should give it a shot. But you shouldn't go into it expecting to farm a Mageblood within 80 maps just because I did. The economy for when you're trying this is going to be different from the economy when I tried it. And with a sample size of 80, I could have gotten significantly lucky or significantly unlucky. Maybe those 2 Cortex drops shouldn't have happened. Maybe I should have gotten 2 Krakic Chimeras. Well, that's a net of 2 div. Maybe that doesn't matter. But maybe I should have gotten 5, which were then doubled into 10. Well, all of a sudden, that's a lot more currency. That's more like 30 div. But maybe you're saying, wait a minute, Krakic Chimeras are 90C. What are you talking about 3 divines each 10? That's the thing about economies. I can't predict the future. I don't know for sure if you're going to be able to recreate my results. And so, if you do try this, go into it with an experimental mindset, and 2, post results down in the comments. Let me know how many maps you did and how much you ended up getting. Generally speaking, I do think this is a profitable strategy. It's really a matter of how much. But occasionally you can get unlucky, or occasionally the market can be so unfavorable that you will lose a little money. And remember, if you're not able to complete the Guardians efficiently, you won't be able to use the Sextant that literally doubles their damage and triples their health, because oh boy, that makes them pretty scary. I'm pretty sure between Delirium, Wisp Juice, and the Sextant, I was basically just fighting Uber bosses the entire time, at least until I stopped doing the Wisp Juicing part, because sadly, it wasn't increasing my profits by nearly as much as I hoped it would. But those were just my experiences, and I'm curious about some of your results as well. If you're looking for something else to watch, maybe check out the stream where I ran Essence Memories and talked about my results a little at the end. Or alternatively, if you want to know one of the core mechanics used by my build, check out my video on why Relic Hash's Impatience is an insanely good item. Before I go, I'd like to take a minute to thank my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible, and you might even see your name on screen right now. Link to support is down below. That's all for me today. While abyss farming may have been one of the most profitable strategies this league, I have to say, the Guardian rushing is one of the most enjoyable that I've done. It's just fast enough that I don't feel like I'm being bogged down, and there's just enough exciting loot that I don't feel like it's a waste of my time. And so, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you again sometime soon.